Let's look at the Mishnah now on Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. We're on the bottom of the Amud. Mosar HaKtoris. Now, on an annual basis, they use the money for the Trumas Halishka to buy samamonim, which were used to create the Ktoris. These various spices were blended together and they were brought on the Mizbeach HaPnimi twice a day, as the Torah mentions in Shmos Perek Lamed. Now, once a year, the Gemara tells us in Krisus Vav, they prepared the Ktores for the entire year that was brought twice daily. And they had a specific amount, a formula for the 11 required spices. There were Achadesre Yud Aleph Samamonim that made up the Ktores. And they produced 368 mana. On a daily basis, one mana was brought on the Mizbeach HaPnimi, half of the mana in the morning, half in the afternoon. And now you have enough Ktores for 365 days. But as we said before, they prepared on an annual basis 368 mana. So we have 3 extra mana. What was that for? That was for the avoda of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, because he did what's called chafina. He put his hands into the Ktores, and he did that twice during the course of Yom Kippur. So therefore, we assume that 2 handfuls on an average of a Kohen Gadol, of course it depends on the size of his hands, would equal to a half a mana. So at the end of each year, there would be a surplus of approximately 3 mana of Ktoris, or a little bit less than 3 mana. Now, keep in mind that this would accumulate over the course of time. And what do we do with that extra incense that would accumulate over the course of time? So he says here, "B'chol shana yukonu mikaspe trumas halishka samamonim avur haktores b'mishkal 368 manim." Okay, so we have an extra 3 mana beyond the 365 days of the year. And on a daily basis, they were maktir half of a mana in the morning and half of a mana in the evening. Now we have 3 extra mana. That was earmarked for the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim for chafina, which was done lifnai v'lifnim, and it was burnt inside the Kodesh Kadosh. Now our Mishnah is going to talk about Mosar HaKtoris, right? Whatever didn't go into the chafnayim of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur from the extra 3 mana that takes you the increment from 365 to 368. That's called Mosar HaKtoris. And if there were any of the 11 types of spices of the 11 samamonim that were not used during the course of the year, then sometimes if it was a shana pshuta, if it wasn't a memuberes, there were only 354 days in a year, because we're talking about the lunar year. So the Mishnah establishes that Mosar HaKtoris and the Gizbarim want to use this Mosar HaKtoris, this surplus, for another year. Mayu Osimba, how could they maintain the kashrus, the status of Mukhshar Lehakara? Now, usually what was purchased with last year's Trumas Halishka cannot be used for next year's Karbanos. Every year is a separate entity as far as the Trumas Halishka from which we purchased the Karbanos Tzibur. So if we use the Trumas Halishka presumably last year to create that volume of Ketores for last year, we have a surplus. How are we able to use it next year? Which means that on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we begin a new year as far as collecting the Trumos and earmarking and purchasing from the Trumas Halishka new Karbanos. It's already Aleph Nisan. So we're in a bind because we want to use this Ketores for next year. But once we pass Aleph Nisan, we need to buy the Ketores from this year's Trumas Halishka that begins with Aleph Nisan. So the Mishnah says, here's the solution to the problem. Mafrishim Mimena, from the Mosar HaKetores, they take off Kishir an amount, and keep in mind the Ketores was very valuable. Schar Umnim, right? The Umnim here are those who produce the Ketores. That's called Mefatmei HaKetores. So let's imagine that the schar for the Umnim is X. How much Ketores would sell for that X? So from the Mosar, we'll separate the amount of Ketores that would cover the wages of the Umnim. Umechalelin osa al mos ha'umnim. In other words, we're going to do a chilul in which we're going to, there are going to be two sets of coins. There's one set of coins that's X, it's worth X, that's the wage for the Umnit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take part of the Ketores that's worth X, and we're going to be machalel the kedusha of the Ketores onto those mos, which are worth X. V'nosin osa. So now what we have is that we were machalel the kedushas Ketores on the mos that were designated for payment to the umnin. So now the mos pick up the kedusha of the Ketores, and the Ketores is yotza l'chul. Nosin osa. Now we give this Ketores, which is worth the same as the wages of the umnin, to the umnin as payment. Nosin osa l'umnin b'schara. Okay, so where are we holding now? Now we have Ketores that's mechuleles, and it's in the hands of the umnin. Lochinosa, chosrim v'lochinosa, the gizbarim will now buy back the Ketores mitruma chadasha from this year's truma post Aleph Nisan. So now the Ketores was sanctified by this year's monies of the Truma Salishka. So we can now bring this Ketores on the Mizbeach. So let's just go over it one more time. we designate money for payment to the Umnin. We machalel the Ketores onto the mos of the Umnin. Then the Ketores is mechuleles. We use the Ketores to pay the Umnin. And then we buy back the Ketores from the Umnin, but this time from the Truma Chadosh, from this year's Truma. Okay. So let's just fast forward to the Gemara, and then Blinetta will finish the Mishnah. Velo Nimtza, the Gemara is asking a question. Shehegdish mischalel ala hegdish. When you designated Mos to pay the wages of the Umnin, and then you machalel the Ketores onto those Mos came from the Trumas Alichka. They had the status of Hegdish. We have a rule that you cannot be machalel Kedusha from Hegdish to Hegdish. You've got Ketores. The Ketores is Hegdish. You have the Mos that came from the Trumas Alichka that were earmarked to pay the wages of the Umnin. That's Hegdish. You can't be Machal Hegdish on Hegdish. The whole concept of Chilul, of Pidyon, only operates when you take Chulin and you transfer Hegdish onto Chulin. So the Gemara immediately asks, V'lo nimtza, a rhetorical question, Hegdish mischal al Hegdish. Okay. So now the Gemara quotes Rab Shimon bar Bis. Says Rab Shimon bar Bisna, Mevi Mos. Let's take the Mos of Hegdish that were designated for payment to the Umnin, Umechalin al Habinyan. What is this binyan? What status does it have? It's a kind of a Twilight Zone status. We'd say in Yiddish, nishtaher and nishtahid. On the one hand, this binyan was built by Hegdish. But on the other hand, it's not Hegdish. It's a binyan banu bichul. It's l'tzorech Hegdish, but it's not Hegdish per se. Now, this is based on a sugya me'ila on Daf Yud Daled that formulates the principle bonim bechol the achar kach makdishim. And this Gemara is quoted here, invoked by the Karbana Eidah, who's the super commentary on the Yerushalmi. Bonim bechol, we can build a building, and we don't have to call it Hegdish at this point. We can be Magdish it after it's built, but while it's built, it's still Chulin. And what we're going to do here, says Reb Shimon, is we're going to take the Mos of Hegdish that were earmarked for payment of wages to the Ummin, and we're going to mechal the Kedushas Mos on a binyan, which right now is a binyan shel chol, even though it's being built for the purpose of Hegdish, but right now it's chol. We weren't magdish it yet. Now what happens is we've transferred the kedusha from the Mos over to the binyan. The most, therefore, now become most chulin. Once the most become most chulin, we can be machal the ketores onto the most chulin, give the ketores to the umnin, and then buy it back. So again, we are adding now another step in this whole Chad Gadya based on Reb Shimon of being machal the most that we're earmarked to pay the wages of the umnin on a binyan. The kedusha of the most now is transferred over to the binyan. The most are now chulin, and we can now be machal the ketores on those most. Maybe ketores umachal aleim. And now we can give the ketores, which is chulin, because the kedushas haketores was transferred over to these mos. The nosin also we give the ketores of chulin leumnin b'schar, and then we buy it back from the umnin with mos from the truma chadosh. So why does Reb Shimon complicate matters by adding another step in this long Chad Gadya? He feels compelled to do so because otherwise, if Hegdesh is allotting money for the payment of the umnin, that money has the status of Hegdesh. It's Mom and Hegdesh. Hence, there's no possibility of being machal the Torres onto the Mos Shel Hegdesh, because he can't be machal Hegdesh onto Hegdesh. So we need to add one step where the Gizbar will have access to Mos Shel Chulin. How does the Gizbar get access to Mos Shel Chulin? The answer is that we have a concept based on the Gemara Me'ilah that Hegdesh could build a binyan, and they were not makdish the binyan. The binyan still remains chol. Later on, they'll be makdish, but before they do so, they're going to be machal the mos that are designated for the payment of the wages of the umnin onto the binyan, such that now the mos are going l'chulin, and now we can be machal the ketores onto those mos, give the ketores to the umnin, and then buy them back with mos of the truma from the truma chadosh. Now the question I want to raise is, the umnin have to get paid. Schar umnin. Hegdesh hired the umnin. It's a contractual agreement. And Hegdesh now, after the umnin created the ketores, owes a debt, a monetary debt to the umnin. The wages are a monetary debt. Why can't they be machal the mos by simply paying up the debt? Why doesn't the payment of the debt itself make the mos into chulin? In which case we can cut out all these middle steps and just simply allot the money for payment and then be machal the ketores on that payment. Apparently payment of a chov, or in this case of schar avoda, of pu'ula, is not included in the mechanics of pidyon, of chulin, of being machal. You can't be machal the mos on the debt that we owe the umnin vis-a-vis the wages that we have to pay. Now, Osan HaMos, the Gemara now wants to know, what do we do with the Mos? Because keep in mind, we will machalel the Ketores onto the Mos, such that now we can give the Ketores, which is mechuleles, to the Umnin. What are we going to do with the Mos? Rebbe Omer Ani Nasnu Lebeis Garmu Ulebeis Avtinos Shoy Bekia Bepita Baktores, Ube Maisa Lechem Hapon. There were certain families that were the known, well experienced, and they had a very reliable reputation of the experts on creating the Torahs. And we still owe them their wages. We were machalel the Torahs, right, the Mosar Torahs onto the Mos. And we can use these Mos, says Rebbe, to pay the wages of the Torahs manufacturers. Now, I have a bunch of questions to ask here, but one idea that I derive from this Gemara is that since the Mos have a kedusha of Ketores, because we machal the Ketores on these Mos, and again, these Mos themselves became chulin through the binyan. So now the Mos take on the status of Ketores. And now I hit a dead end, sort of. Now I have a gap, which I don't know how to traverse this gap, but somehow, if the Mos have the kedusha of Ketores, they are earmarked to pay the wages of the manufacturer of the Ketores. Let me just see if anyone could fill in that gap for me over here. What is done with the money that was used to deconcentrate the incense? Deconsecrate. Okay, a new word. Deconsecrate. In Hebrew, chilul. He says, it's obvious that this money assumed the sanctity that was previously upon the Torahs. And therefore it is now consecrated as last year's Trumas Halishka. Before being deconsecrated, the Ketores possessed the sanctity of last year's Trumas Alishka, with which it was originally purchased. Upon deconcentration, its sanctity was transferred to the chulin money that was used for chilul. Thus, the money is now consecrated with the sanctity of last year's Trumas Halishka. Therefore, it is used to pay the wages of the artisans who prepare the incense and the panel and the ponim, lechem aponim, whose wage is taken from the Trumas Halishka. I think I found the missing link here. I think. The missing link is that any wages that accrue to a person because of tzorach hakorban, he prepared a korban tzibur, those wages can be paid from the Trumas Halishka. Oh, I hear the siren. My wife points out that the siren is going on. So what I understand from this is that these umnin will be paid by the monies that we used to be machal ktores, because since the ktores itself is a carbon tzibur, the funds of which are taken from the Trumas Halishka, therefore paying for the production, the manufacture of the ktores is also money that comes from the Trumas Halishka. In other words, the labor that was invested to create the ktores is the same as the ktores itself. So just like I can use the money of Trumas Halishka to buy the 11 incenses that we needed, spices for the ktores, so likewise, one of the ingredients in creating the ktores is the labor and the payment of the wages for the labor. That money likewise comes from the Trumas Halishka. So when I am a chalel the ktores onto mos, those mos take on the same kedusha, the same status of hegdesh as the ktores itself. And that means that just like the ktores could be purchased from monies of the Trumas Halishka, and therefore these monies now have the kedusha of Trumas Halishka monies, because the ktores itself is purchased from the Trumas Halishka, and therefore the mos on which I was, he calls it deconcentrated, I was machalel the ktores, those mos are mos of Trumas Halishka. They can be used to pay for any monies that was spent for the ktores, namely the labor that we have to pay, the wages that we have to pay. That was the missing link in this sugya. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, Vehein sheyu chayovim lahem mos mishar rishon. And he says the following, that this din, that we could take the mos that have the kedusha of Trumas Halishka and use them to pay base garmo or base avtinas, that only makes sense, that can only apply when the gizbar of the hegdesh is already obligated to pay for the work, the labor that was done last year by these two families in creating and manufacturing the ktores. We can pay them from the ktores that they created, so to speak, not in the form of ktores, but rather in the form of the mos upon which we machal the ktores. So the ktores came from last year's Trumas Halishka. The mos therefore have the status of last year's Trumas Halishka. We can use those mos to pay the base garmo and base avtinus, but only on the condition that they did the work last year to produce the ktores. A chov has already emerged in last year's account. You know, if you pay an accountant per year to declare your taxes, this goes on last year's cheshbon. Avol, however, if we were to pay them for work that they did this year, then we'd have to pay them from mos that have the status of Truma Chadasha. So let's say, for example, in ER, they would have manufactured the ktores, that we cannot use the mos that were used to be machalel last year's ktores to pay the workers for this year's work. Rab Chia bar Ba boy, he asked the following question: Lo hayu chayavim lahem mos mishar rishona. What are we going to do in a case where we don't own any money, or we have no debt of wages for any work that was done last year. So you've got mos that have been sanctified with Truma Yeshana of last year. You've got wages that you owe for this year. You're in a bind because you cannot earmark last year's Trumas Halishka money for work for a chov and tashlumei schar of this year. Also, Rabbi Ba, he's the most popular guy we've had here in Masechet Shekalim. Probably his name was Abba, I don't know. B'Shem Rabbi Chia, B'Shem Rabbi Yossi. Yushalmi is very careful about all the names. Makaitzim bohem es hamizbeach. The most of last year's truma can be earmarked in a case where we don't have any wages to pay up from last year's account, last year's cheshbon, to buy zvachim, to buy behemos from the Ketz HaMizbeach. Now, why is that so? So this is the Mishnah that we skipped on Daf Yud that quotes Rabbi Akiva, who says that Mosar Trumas Halishka, that if we have last year's Trumas Halishka money that was surplus money, we can use it for Ketz HaMizbeach. And basically, any mos that we used for chilul of last year's Ketores have the same status as Mosar Trumas Halishka. So since Rabbi Akiva establishes that Mosar Trumas Halishka can be redirected for Ketz HaMizbeach, so too the mos on which the Ketores was Nischalel, last year's Ketores, have the same status as Mosar Trumas Halishka, meaning they weren't used last year, so we can now use them for Ketz HaMizbeach. So let me just see if we can do a little bit of detective work here. The Mishnah is here on Daf Yud Amud Beis. And the Mishnah says that Rabbi Akiva Omer Mosar Truma L'Ketz HaMizbeach. Mosar Truma L'Ketz HaMizbeach. And here he's disagreeing apparently with Rabbi Yishmael. So the surplus of the withdrawn Shekalim, what do we do with it? So Rabbi Akiva says it's used for Ketz HaMizbeach. He says the rationale for using the remainder of the truma for the Ketz HaMizbeach is that these very coins were indeed initially set aside to purchase animals for sacrifice. We're missing a piece of the puzzle here. But basically, what he's saying is that Trumas Halishka is for karbanos, and therefore Mosar Trumas Halishka can also be used for karbanos. I think there's more to it here. I think there's something deeper about Kates HaMizbeach, that maybe Kates HaMizbeach is not limited to the annuum. It's not like, when you have extra money that was earmarked for karbanos, we can only use it within a certain year, within a certain time allotment. But rather, this money that is surplus money for karbanos rises above the limitations of time and space. They're not limited to one particular year. But again, it needs a lot more work. I think Rav Soloveitchik has somewhere a piece of Torah about Kates HaMizbeach. Let me just see. Just want to see. I mean, now's not the time to. Is there? So I'm not finding it. I see here Midos HaMizbeach. What about Kates HaMizbeach? So it's not here on this list. Look at that. Doesn't prove anything. You probably have to know more about Me'ilah also. All right. So let's see how much we have. We have time. Rabbi Ba Bar Cohen, guess another Rabbi Ba, Ba Kume Rabbi Yosef. So he raised the question in the presence of Rabbi Yosef. Mechalfa Shitase de Rabbi Chia Bar Ba. There's a problem here with the statement of Rabbi Chia Bar Ba. Why? Taman Srichale V'Kap Shitale. It's very strange because Rabbi Chia Bar Ba initially was in doubt. He didn't know what the status, what the din is of these mos, which had chilul of Ketores of last year, and therefore had the status of Truma Yeshana in a case where we don't have any wages to pay for last year's labor, and then Kop Shitale. And then all of a sudden, he woke up and he was absolutely convinced that we should earmark it for the case of Mizbeach. Because if you take a look, Rabbi Chia Bar Ba was the one who asked this question, and Rabbi Ba quotes Rabbi Chia Bar Ba giving the answer. So was he in doubt about it, or did he know about it? Was he certain about it? So the Gemara says the following. This is where Rabbi Yasa is talking as a response to this question, Rabbi Ba. In other words, it was absolutely clear in the mind of Rabbi Chia Bar Ba that these mos of Truma Yeshana can definitely be used for the Kates HaMizbeach. That wasn't an issue. His suffix was that when you chalal the Ketores, the Mosar Ketores, onto these mos, then the mos should have the din of Mosar Nisachim. Now let's see if we can figure out What about Moser Nesachim? So let's go back for a moment again to the same Mishnah on Daf Yudam and Beis. Oh, so the Mishnah tells us on Daf Yudam and Beis that Mosar Nisachim, quoting Rab Chanina Skan Kohanim, is L'Kli Shares. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out why Mosar Nisachim is earmarked for Kli Shares. No, I don't have anything on that. The Mesifta draws a blank here for me. All right, so that's another hole here in our Chorbaskala. He says the following. Hasofeku in Mosar Ktores, Yeshel of Kedushas Haguf, V'lachein Dino Kimosar Nisachim. Okay, and we just finished saying that what? That Mosar Nisachim is L'Kli Shares. What's the connection here between Kedushas Haguf and not using the money for Ketzah Mizbeach, but rather for Kli Shares? He says, "Asofik hu mosar ktoris yeshalav kedushas haguf and imsa dino kimosar nesachim o she'enalav kedushas haguf." Shorish asofik hu ha'im amachteshes sheba shochakim es haktores he kli sharis v'nimtzeis shaktores miskadesh sal yoda b'kedushas haguf o ein amachteshes kli sharis the ein haktores kasha Kedosha b'kedushas haguf. And I both have to admit I don't understand this, but it's fascinating. I'm absolutely fascinated by this. Let me just see if he adds anything here. Reb Chia Barba's inquiry was asking concerning the using of the money for service vessels, rooted in an underlying question regarding the incense. If the incense is prepared in a service vessel, then the money whose sanctity derives from the incense may be used for service vessels. If the incense does not require a service vessel, then the money may not be used to purchase service vessels. And then the Gemara says this Palgun, we have a machlokes, pitma bechulin, if he compounded the incense in a non-sacred vessel, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina Omar, psula, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omar, kshera. According to Rabbi Yossi, the Torres has to be prepared in a kli shares. When to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, it could be compounded even in a kli chol. And Reb Chia bar Ba vacillated about this issue. My time of the Rabbi Yossi ber Rabbi Kanina. Why does he require a kli shares, a machteshes, I guess? Because Kodesh he, the pasuk, I guess in Shmos, says Kodesh he. And what's this Kodesh he? Shetehei aviyasa b'kodesh. My time the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kodesh he shetei ba mitrumas halishka. So therefore, the Torah does not have to be prepared with a kli sharis. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the verse teaches that when the Torah is burned, it must be consecrated with the sanctity of Trumas Halishka. But the pasuk is not teaching us that the Torah must be prepared with a kli sharis. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, a private person can produce Torah, meaning from a kli chol, and donate it to the Mikdash. The nafkamina is going to be, again, whether we use the mos on which we machal the Torah for Ketz HaMizbeach or for the purchase of a kli shares. If we need a kli shares in order to create Torah, it means the Kedushas HaTorah is identical with that of the Kedushas kli shares that generated this sanctity. And Memela, I used the monies on which I was machal the Torah to buy a kli shares. But if, on the other hand, I can create a Torah even with a kli chol, a private individual, and then he can consecrate it by giving it over to the Mikdash. The Mikdash is going to buy it with Trumas Haluchka money, then it doesn't have that unique kedusha of a kli shares. And therefore, when I'm machalel the Torah onto mos, those mos are not going to be dedicated for the purchase of a kli shares. They have the regular din of Trumas Haluchka money, which is used to buy karbanos. And in this case, Ketz HaMizbeach. I'll tell you the truth, Rabbosai. It sounds to me, this is, I don't know enough kudshim to evaluate this. If you know, please tell me. But try not to embarrass me, but tell me. That a kli shares has a more profound sanctity than a karma. I mean, on the one hand, you could say that kli shares is very unique in that anything that goes inside the kli shares automatically becomes sanctified. So the kli shares has a cause to be makadish. But to say that it has a greater kedusha than a kedusha zevach doesn't sound right to me. But the general direction in which we're going, the suffix of Rabbi Ba was whether or not Rabbi Chia bar Ba was whether or not the monies should go to the Ketz HaMizbeach for karbanos, or they should be dedicated for kli shares. As if to say it's not enough to reach that level of kedusha of a carbon, but rather you have to go beyond that to the level of a kli shares. Let me just see. I know we're running low on time, and I would like to get to the bottom of the Amud, but on the other hand, just by chance, Hashem somehow sends us help from Shamayim. Maybe by chance, in the Yalkut Biurim in the back, he would add something here as far as this suffix. he has a discussion here about the status of the machteshes, which they used to crush the samamonim and create the Torahs. Just not sure that that's exactly what we're looking for here. Istapek Rabbi Chia Barba, Hayim Efshel Lasos Mimos Mosar Haktores Klisharis. Avalikates Hamizbeach Vadai Cheruuyos He. Okay, so that's what we learned. We weren't sure why, but that Ubira Sofeku, Kevan Shemitzad Echad Mos Elu Hem Begeder Mosar Truma, Shedino Lekates Hamizbeach, that was Rabbi Akiva. O Dilma Begeder Mosar Halishka He. Oh, so now we have a new concept that, again, we have to go back to Daf Yud for this, called Mosar Halishka. He says the Kevan Shemefatmin Mitchilo Mefatmin Yoser Mishira Nitzach L'Shona Zu Lekach Im Lo Yitafsher Lifdosa V'Leknosa Mitruma Chadosha Sheyu Mutarim Mosrosea Begeder Mosar Halishka Atzma. L'chein Efshel Lasses Mehem Kli Sharis. Okay, so you see, at least we're in the right ballpark. I mean, they're working very hard to figure this out. I mean, unfortunately, we don't seem to have enough of the Kalim, to analyze this. So I guess, I was told that this Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph is a critical Mishnah, but I think the information that I was lacking here was that this Mishnah really can be understood properly only if you have a great insight and a grasp on the Mishnah Daf Yud Amud Beis. Does anybody find the Mosar Alishka over here? Just quickly peruse and see. Mosar Truma. Mosar Nesachim. Where am I skipping this? Right now, I'm not finding it. I'm sure it's right there, but not finding it. Anybody see it by any chance? Okay, not finding it. Harash Soleo Pirush. Imein Chayov Lemos Bichonicha over Yefshel Chalas Aktoris Almos Achiros. Misfeko Sharab Chiyahi. Ma Yasu in Mosa Aktoris. Mikris Zeh. Whole nother pshat. What are we going to do with Mosar Haktoris? Valzel Meres Hagmar Shalini Kates Amizbech Badai Roy Hu Shechalu Es Haktoris. Al Behemish Yak review Le Kates Amizbech. Shebememes Mosar Shrumahi. Avalinia Klisharis is Tapek Reb Chia, Ha'im roy lechal kedushasa ala kelim sheyu leklei asharis. V'yisod hasofiku kemen sheshaninu b'mishnah kodem shel Rabbi Akiva mosar nisachim lekli shares. V'tama davar yishum nisachim kedoshim v'kedusha saguf v'chein kli shares. Ume'ata yesh this topic victores ha'im is kadeshes hi b'kli shares kimo anisachim o lo. So again, there's some premise here that if the status of the Kodesh was generated by Klishares, then we can use the Mosar for purchase of a Klishares. And we're not sure exactly what generates the sanctity of the Ketores. Let's just see if we could quickly make a race to the finish line. Omar Aboshaya. So the Gemara, oh wait, we skipped Omar Rav Yossi Bei Rav Bun Asya de Rav Yossi Bar Chanina Kishmuel Ud Rav Yeshua ben Levi Rav Yochanan. In other words, the issue about whether you need a makteshes that's a klisharis to create the ketores is an issue that apparently divided Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan. It's Ninon. In the next mission, it says, "Hamagdish nechasav v'hoyu bahen dvarim haru'uyim lekarbanos tzibur." So, what's exactly dvarim haru'uyim lekarbanos tzibur? It's not an animal, which is roy lekarbanos tzibur, because that's roy for carbon yachid as well. So, Yochanan lektoris. The Yachid cannot bring a Ketores. A Ketores is only for the Tzibur. So the Ketores now is included under the phrase, the opening koteret of the Mishnah of Hamagdish Nechasav Nichsei Chulin. So it means if the Ketores is considered Nichsei Chulin, then it must mean that we can use a Machteshes Shalchol to produce and manufacture the Ketores. That's against Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, and he's not willing to pinpoint the Ketores as a category of Hayben Dvarim Sheru'iyim L'Karbanos Tzibur. Rav Hoshia, no. You have no proof from Rabbi Yochanan. Tipoter bi uman mishel beis avtinos shayanotel b'scharo ketores. In other words, they would earmark money from the Trumas HaLishka to pay the wages of those who created the ketores. And Kadam ha'uman vehigdish es nichsei achulin shelo ubetochan haktores he dvarim haru'uyim lekarbanos hatzibur. And Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina kishmuel. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, on the other hand, holds like Shmuel, who holds that the machteshes must be a kli shares. The Omer of Rav Huna b'shem Shmuel machteshes asu osa ki kli shares lekadesh. So this has to do with the psul of lina, or alternatively the psul of tvul yom. If he comes in contact with the ketores, it passes the ketores because the machteshes has the status of a kli shares, and therefore the ketores likewise has that status. Omer Rab Yossi Bei Rav Bon Amora Rav Chuna, this din of Shmuel, Kome Rabbi Yossi, and Rav Chuna asked, according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if the machteshes is a klichol, then the ketores is being created only with the kedushas damim. Then we understand the Mishnah that we can be machalel the ketores on mos. But according to Shmuel, who holds that the machteshes has to be a kli shares, and therefore the ketores now has kedushas haguf, then dover shekadish bekli shares nifte. We have a halacha in Masechet Menachos that which is sanctified by a kli shares has no pidyon. So how could we possibly be mechalel the ketores onto mos? Amalei v'lo de Shmuel. He says you shouldn't ask this question on Shmuel because the Shmuel Omar kalhu b'mosa. Okay, so this is a separate halacha of kalhu b'mosa. Kula miyucheresi b'mosa kodshim. Leiv bezdin masna lehem shekedush saguf shalem kayemes rakim hutzrachu lahem b'im lavhem kedoshim lidmeim bilvad. The leiv bezdin masna has the power to take something that was sanctified by kedush saguf, and if an event that we don't need it for that sanctity, we can't bring it as a korban, then it becomes kedushas dam. That's how Shmuel is going to understand that there's chilul on ketores, because Shmuel lishitasos that ketores was sanctified with kedushas guf, insofar as the machteshes that created the ketores was a kli shares. Hence, there's no possibility of chilul because of the principle in Masechta Menachos that Torah Nigdash Bekli Ein Lo Pidyon. But the answer is Leiv Bezdin Mas. Okay, that's where we got up.